الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
Hi and welcome to Worlds Apart, a program that is dedicated to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Rommel Gussain, and today we have with us Dr. David Smith, who'll be speaking to us about ideologies that are worlds apart. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Great, nice to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to have you come here and share some of your insights with us. What I would like to hone in on today specifically is Islam's law code. Do they have a law code or a law system, I should ask?
Yes, indeed. They're quite a distinct system, generally referred to as Sharia, the Sharia law. Mm-hmm. Sharia just means the way, in other words, the way we should behave. Mm-hmm. And that is contained in the Quran, but also some aspects of Sharia law come out of the Hadiths, which are the volumes written by various companions of Muhammad. Some of it comes out of Muhammad's own lifestyle, the way he behaved, the way he answered questions. So there are a number of different sources of that law, and then the law itself is actually broken up by different intellectual groups within Islam. So we actually have 4 different systems of Sharia law, which makes it all very complex. Mm-hmm. But for most people, they just know whatever system they happen to be living with. In any one area, there'll just be one Sharia system at work.
Why is it so important? Is it important to Muslims?
Well, it is important because the most important thing for a Muslim, and this is a matter, I think, of considerable respect that we might well have for a Muslim, mm-hmm. is that they want to be obedient to Allah and to His will. And if we're going to be obedient to God, then you want to know what is God saying, what does He require of us. And so from the Muslim point of view, the requirements of Allah are set out fundamentally, of course, in the Sharia, in the Quran, but it's been extended beyond that to include both Muhammad's life as well as the hadiths, the statements of the companions. But that's their desire. They long to be obedient to Allah. And so, therefore, they would like to see a Sharia law in place. Of course, it needs interpretation, as all laws do. And ultimately, you go to a Sharia court to get interpretation, just as you would in, say, the Western world with our Western laws. Mm-hmm. Our parliaments may well determine aspects of our laws, and then if those laws are not fully understood or we don't think they're applied in the correct way, we can take that to a court. In the case of the Muslim community, they of course do not like to have Parliament setting the law, because the law, the Sharia, is already predetermined by Allah through the revelation which we find in the Quran. So there is no need for human interference. We simply need to be obedient to Allah's law, in other words, the Sharia.
Is it practiced anywhere at the moment, Sharia law? Are there some examples of that?
Yes, indeed. In fact, if you go to any Islamic state, that is automatically considered to be fundamental to their law. If you go to a country that's not, generally speaking, known to be an Islamic state, let's say like Indonesia, the Indonesian government has not adopted Sharia law, but it has allowed Aceh, which is the large area, the very northern part of Indonesia, to have Sharia law within its own boundaries. So it's like a province, and that province of Aceh now has Sharia law, which means that if somebody breaks a law of some sort, ultimately it's the Sharia court that will determine whether a Sharia law has been broken and therefore what the punishment is.
When I look, across the West, when I look at European countries, fundamentally and essentially one can say that a lot of the laws that are there are principally Christian laws. Now, even though perhaps one could argue that they've regressed somewhat from those original laws that were in place there, but still the spirit of them is very much Christian. So, how do Muslims view democratic law or Christian law?
Well, basically, they of course don't like anything that's not a Sharia. So that becomes the fundamental position. Mm-hmm. But as they look at, let's say, laws as determined by Western world, the first opposition is that these laws have been determined by human minds and therefore are wrong because they should only accept Allah's laws. Secondly, the question then arises, are the laws being obeyed? And a large number of Muslims would feel that the Western world is not obeying its own laws. Maybe some aspects of those laws are not adequately defined. I think probably the biggest single area of concern, genuine concern by Muslims, is that a lot of the ways in which the Western world displays itself appears to be immoral. For instance, the way women dress on television. Now, many of them, of course, dress quite adequately, but there are times when they don't dress adequately, and then that is seen to be an immoral act. Mm-hmm. And therefore, that's a Western act, and for the Islamic mind, there isn't real distinction between the Western world and the Christian world. So that lack of distinction means that they then blame the Christians for immorality. They know also, for instance, that there are people who will have immoral personal behaviour. Now, whilst that is judged under the Christian law, and for the most part is judged under Western law, not all aspects are judged, particularly what is purely a personal act. So, for instance, let's take homosexuality. The Sharia law is quite clearly antagonistic to homosexuality. In the past, some of the Western countries have also taken a stance legally against it. Mm-hmm. Today, that is generally speaking not so. And to the extent that that is not so, that would be seen by most Muslims as therefore being an immoral activity which the West allows and therefore which Christians allow. And so they feel that that is an inadequate way of thinking about how we should behave. And then they will turn to the Sharia law as being the outline of how they should behave.
Is it very much different than democracy?
Well, it's different on the grounds that democracy is a human determination. Mm-hmm. Democracy means ordinary people get together by election or whatever method and rule the country and determine the laws. And to the Muslim mind, that is an inappropriate way forward because the only law that should exist is God's laws, Allah's laws. And human laws are a product of the imagination and not necessarily reflecting God or Allah's laws. So they would object to it on those grounds.
Would they be able to work together? I mean, I'm led to believe that in some countries, such as the UK, certain aspects of Sharia can actually work with democracy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in the UK, it has been agreed only fairly recently that Sharia law can be applied in domestic issues, in particular in respect to divorce or death, as to how then an estate is divided, or in the case of divorce, how the family may be divided and the resources divided. So any other domestic issues can be taken by Muslims to a Sharia court for decision making. And those Sharia courts are technically supported by Westminster. So in other words, the London system is to support a decision of a Sharia court. So in England today, we do have Sharia law in respect only to domestic issues, running parallel to the Western law determined democratically by Westminster. But then outside of domestic issues, all other legal matters must be determined by Westminster. So they run alongside each other in a limited area. That is the only country where that actually occurs in the world. There have been attempts in other places to sometimes bring in Sharia alongside a democratic system. For the most part, it's been opposed particularly by women, that is Muslim women. But in most other countries, it doesn't work alongside. It's either Sharia or it's not Sharia.
And that would seem to be the case classically. So historically, it was Sharia. It wasn't supposed to work alongside a different system of law, is that right?
Not at all. You know, either you're obedient to Allah or you're not obedient to Allah.
Okay.
So therefore Sharia should be the one law that's in existence. Of course, in a Western country, let's say like England, those who are not Muslims can follow their own laws, whereas Muslims should follow Sharia.
So let me ask you, David, how do the majority of Muslims see Sharia, the system of Sharia law? I mean, I'm led to believe that they feel as though it is a much better, it's a much superior system of law.
Yes, they would certainly believe that, because it's a very precise law and it deals with a whole range of issues, not only domestic but indeed in other parts of one's life. And it's, let's say, a sufficiently precise law for many non-Muslims to think they'd be glad to become a Muslim because they want to be obedient to that law, knowing in particular that if you're being obedient to Sharia, you're being obedient to Allah.
Okay.
And that's the thrust of it. Sharia law is not determined by human beings. It is supposedly determined by Allah as recited through the angel Gabriel, through Muhammad, and therefore recorded for us in the Quran. And of course ultimately in Muhammad's life as well. But because it is seen to be Allah's law, therefore it must be superior to all other laws, because all other laws are, generally speaking, determined by human beings. And human beings can't obviously match Allah. Now, from a Christian point of view, then the question arises, well, does Sharia law match the law as we know it from what God has revealed himself through the Bible? Now, can I take that up a little bit more? Because what I would like to do is to pick up a Bible, if I may, and turn, for instance, to some of the statements that have been made in respect to the law for the Christian person.
Please do, yes.
And you see, there seems to me here quite a big difference. That whilst Sharia is very precise, and I know that I'll get punished if I do certain things wrong, the difference for the Christian isn't that you're necessarily punished, although that may be a good thing to do on a human front, but from God's point of view, it's a question of how do you come before God? Are you going to deal with that thing that has been done wrong, and are you going to seek forgiveness from those to whom you've caused the error of some sort? But ultimately, you've also got to seek forgiveness from God himself. It's not enough just to say, look, terribly sorry I did that, I shouldn't have done it, to that person, but you should also go back to God and say how you stand before God. Well, this is what's been written about that sort of statement, that God is rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us. Now, that to me is the most fundamental point, that it's a relationship with God, whereas Sharia is a relationship with a written word. In the same way that in the West, my disobedience of a law is also a breakdown of a relationship with the law. And if I want to disagree with a law, I may well decide to go to a court and argue. But what am I arguing about? I'm arguing about the words of the law and saying I did or did not obey that law. But the relationship, as far as the Christian is concerned, is a relationship with a person of God. And so as this passage in Ephesians chapter 2 makes very clear, that God being rich in mercy, this is the nature of God. And the nature of him is that he is so rich in mercy because of his great love which he loved us. So it's a relationship. It's a relationship with a person who cares about me, cares about you, and cares about everybody who's watching us today. And because he cares for us, he then goes on to say that therefore, that whilst we may in one sense be called dead in our trespasses, in other words, because we do things wrong, it is as if the relationship with God is dead. It doesn't exist until you do something about it. Nevertheless, he has made us alive together with Christ. In other words, there's the option, because it's a relationship. I'm not just being made alive with a written word, with a legal word. I'm being alive with a person, the person of Jesus. Therefore, by grace you have been saved. Now that phrase is probably the most fundamental phrase for a Christian. Because my relationship with Jesus, my relationship with God, if you like, is a relationship of his grace, of his mercy, of him saying, yes, David, you have done wrong. I'm willing to accept that you've done wrong and to forgive, because Jesus has paid the price for what you did wrong through his death on the cross. Now that's a big issue under the word grace. But the point of it is that God is saying that you can't just simply get forgiven. It costs something. And the cost ultimately is death. But it's not your death. Jesus died on your behalf. Therefore, by his grace, I am saved from death. And I'm saved into a living relationship, an eternal relationship with him. And so the passage will go on to explain that indeed Jesus does sit with God in the heavenly place, and that indeed that by grace we have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Not a result of works, so that no human being can boast, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them.
So that last part, prepared for good works. So God is concerned about what we do, because as you were talking there, I'm just sort of thinking about it from perhaps a Muslim mindset. It's as though, we're very quick to say that, God is willing to forgive you, and it's as though, God's not concerned about what we do. Is he concerned?
He is indeed concerned. And indeed he's died for us. I mean, he's concerned to the point of his own death.
Yes.
But ultimately his purpose, his intentions, his desire for each one of us is indeed to be really Christ-like, to follow the character of Christ. He's created us not just to be people that do whatever we like. He's created us in his own image to in fact do good works in the way that he would. In other words, to be righteous, to righteously reflect the character of God in both what I personally do, but also in my behaviour towards others. In other words, if I've got a living, graceful relationship with God, then I should demonstrate that same living, graceful relationship with you and with other people. Therefore, I am created to do good works. He does not want me to do things that are wrong. And so, of course, in the Old Testament we have, for instance, the well-known 10 Commandments, which is a reminder that as God says, I am the Lord your God, therefore you shall have no other gods before me. Therefore you shall honour your parents. And so it goes on. In other words, it's very clear about us being righteous, but ultimately our righteousness is because God makes us righteous before him.
How does the Sharia or Sharia affect the community?
Well, the community of, let's say, the Muslim community, they will automatically want everybody to follow Sharia, and because we're human beings, people make mistakes, people do things that are wrong, and so the Sharia courts will apply Sharia law to those people, and the community will expect people to be punished in accordance with Sharia law. In the case of the Western community, we expect people to be punished in accordance with the Western law because their relationship is with the Western law. But at the same time, for the Christian, the relationship is not only with the Western law, it is also with God. And then the question is, well, then will God punish? And so the passage I've got from Ephesians is that God is willing to exercise his grace of mercy and forgiveness if we want to accept that free gift.
Well said, well spoken. How does it specifically affect women? That's Sharia.
Well, Sharia law can be quite harsh towards women, and is probably one of the reasons why Sharia law is, and particularly Sharia courts, are often rejected by women in, let's say, the Western countries. For instance, in Ontario, in Canada, there was a real desire to bring to bear Sharia courts and Sharia law. And it was the women, the Muslim women, who objected to it.
Really?
Yes, because of the way they are treated. Under Sharia law, for instance, the woman is downgraded. They are less than a man. And I mean, I can quote from the Quran if we have time to do that, and I can give you some texts from the Quran which show that man is superior to women.
Please.
And so those sorts of quotations, let me just use, I have here the Quran in front of me, and I can pick up some aspects of the attitude. For instance, from Surah chapter 4, or Surah 4, verse 34, men are the protectors and maintainers of women, because Allah has given the one more strength than the other, and they have the means, and therefore even righteous women will be devout and obedient to their husband.
So what's that saying there, just in essence?
Well, just in that sentence alone, the comment is that the men are superior and women should be obedient to them. Or you get in the same surah some other statements of the same sort of order. For instance, in verse 3 of Surah 4, that you can marry, this is men, may marry women of their choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then you should only have one. That whatever your right hand possesses, that is, whatever number of women that you have, you will indeed do what you like with them. Now, this sort of statement shows that it's the men who are the superior being, that women are being put down, and so much so that, you know, a man can have, you know, a number of women as wives. Now, there are some reasons why that is possible. It means that if he doesn't like one wife, he can have another wife without divorcing the first one. That could be an argument that a Muslim person could make. But it means that that woman who was, say, was the number one wife is suddenly put down because suddenly this man goes off and has a second or third or fourth wife. The fact that women must be kept within the home, for instance, which is outlined not only in the Quran but indeed in many of the hadiths, also makes very clear that women have a role that's domestic and they shouldn't go out and be involved in business or professional life. There are a number of things like this which unfortunately do place women in a rather second-class position.
Well, from what you're saying, I can see that there are a lot of different changes, a lot of things that would perhaps conflict with our current system or a democratic system. Once again, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. It's always a pleasure to have you come and to give us a talk and educate us a little bit about Islam. If I could just turn to our viewers and also thank them, I pray that you found this show to be very informative. As was mentioned before, some of these things will pop up on the screen so you can check them out for yourself. Also, please stay in tune for the very next episode. May God bless you. Thank you.